The political, social, and economic backdrop of 1970s America. The 1970s in the United States was a decade marked by seismic shifts, turbulence, and a lingering sense of uncertainty that bled into every layer of society. The decade dawned amid the bitter aftertaste of the Vietnam War, a conflict that had not only cost thousands of American lives, but also left a generation questioning the integrity of its leaders and the righteousness of its national course. The wounds of that war extended far beyond the battlefield, seeping into American homes, manifesting as protests, a crisis of faith in government, and a growing chasm between generations. Economically, the country trudged through dark times. America faced its first massive oil crisis in 1973, when OPEC's oil embargo sent fuel prices skyrocketing and lines of cars snaking around petrol stations became the new normal. Inflation soared, unemployment rates climbed, and so did the national sense of malaise. The stagflation of the decade was a confounding blend, stagnant growth mixed depressingly with rising prices that stumped policymakers and battered ordinary households. For many, the American dream now looked like something you might glimpse through a fogged pane, faint, uncertain, flickering at the edges. This was also a decade where cities struggled, especially in the industrial heartlands of the Midwest and the Northeast. Urban decay became a haunting motif, factories shuttered, neighborhoods crumbled, and crime rates surged. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago were grappling with the fallout of deindustrialization, while the suburbs sprawled outward, their own residents not immune to the era's problems. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement's tidal wave continued to reshape American life. The passage of major legislation in the 1960s had not erased racism or poverty, a fact driven home by violent clashes and ongoing inequities. Feminism was also coming into sharper focus, with the push for equal rights for women sparking both hope and fierce backlash. Women flocked into the workforce in greater numbers, challenging norms and expectations that had held for generations. On the cultural front, the decade was caught between the dying embers of the 1960s counterculture and the uneasy conservatism that would crest in the 1980s. Disco clubs throbbed in the cities, while a longing for nostalgia was evident in TV shows and films set in a mythic past. The Me Decade, as journalist Tom Wolfe coined it, saw a surge in self-exploration, therapy, and a relentless pursuit of personal fulfillment. Layered atop all of these shifts was a sharp uptick in crime. Homicides, robberies, and assaults reached record highs. Serial killers, names that would become infamous across the country, were active, feeding into nightly newscasts and public anxiety. The justice system, already burdened by overcrowded prisons and overworked police, struggled to keep pace. Escapes and manhunts were more common than anyone wanted to admit, and many Americans began to worry that safety was no longer a given, even in small towns or snow-laden rural communities. By 1977, the air hung heavy with uncertainty, suspicion, and a gnawing sense that American society was being tested in new and terrifying ways. Small towns felt it just as acutely as big cities. A single crime could send shockwaves through an entire region, exposing vulnerabilities and fears that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. Introduction of the main character, Kevin Miller. Let's shine a spotlight on the enigmatic, troubled, and ultimately dangerous figure at the center of this chilling episode, Kevin Miller. He is the quintessential example of a man forged in the crucible of hardship, neglect, and systemic failure, whose journey down the path of crime reads like a tragic novel etched across the American landscape of the late 20th century. Born in 1946, in a crumbling neighborhood on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio, Kevin was the second of 3 children in a family that never truly felt whole. His father, a machinist laid off during the waning years of heavy industry, bounced from odd job to odd job, often coming home in a silent, heavy-lidded rage. His mother worked long, thankless hours as a diner waitress, her laughter rare, her eyes clouded by exhaustion and disappointment. Their small rented home was a battleground. Arguments flared over unpaid bills, drinking, and dreams deferred. Physical discipline was swift and merciless, leaving little room for gentle affection or stability. Kevin's early childhood was marked by insecurity, both emotional and physical. He was a boy who learned early that you either took what you wanted, or you went without. In elementary school, his teachers described him as sullen and combative, quick to challenge authority, and uninterested in following rules. Petty theft soon followed, theft of lunch money, candy, or the odd tool from a neighbor's garage, rarely driven by need but rather as a means of control, a way to prove he could shape an unfair world to his benefit. By adolescence, the pattern was set. He fell in with other kids from broken homes, boys who haunted pool halls and back alleys, looking for trouble or simply trying to fill up empty hours. During his teenage years, minor run-ins with the law became more serious: vandalism, shoplifting, then escalating to breaking and entering. Each trip to the county juvenile facility left him more bruised but less afraid. He even began to regard those stints as badges of honor, marks of a misunderstood rebel. While Kevin was not lacking in raw intelligence, he had little patience for schooling or for the prospect of steady work. Expulsions followed suspensions, and by the time he turned 15, he was already considered a lost cause by most authority figures in his city. His probation officers noted his lack of remorse and pronounced distrust of adults. Sometimes, when pressed, Kevin would mention vivid dreams of running, escaping from everyone and everything, but those moments of vulnerability were fleeting. Adulthood offered him little respite. In his early 20s, Kevin drifted through a series of low-paying jobs: warehouse loader, auto mechanic, occasional line cook. Any attempt at normalcy would be undercut by periods of explosive anger, sudden disappearances, and a growing dependency on alcohol and prescription painkillers he scrounged from doctors' offices or lifted from medicine cabinets. Friends, those who remained, described him as fiercely loyal but profoundly unpredictable, capable of surprising tenderness but equally quick to take offense, especially when he sensed betrayal or disrespect. A turning point came at the age of 27, when, in a rare attempt at settling down, Kevin married his high school sweetheart, Lorraine. Their fleeting happiness produced a daughter, Emily, but domestic bliss was not in his nature. Financial pressures mounted, infidelity haunted their marriage, and Kevin's violent outbursts became more frequent. Within a year, Lorraine took Emily and fled, leaving him to spiral further out of control. As his life unraveled, Kevin moved from small-time scams to more serious crimes: check fraud, car theft, armed assault. It was a matter of survival and pride, a dark way of asserting control over a world he felt had always conspired against him. His rap sheet grew with each arrest, and yet, somehow, he always managed to slip through the cracks. A lawyer's plea bargain here, an administrative error there. In police records, he's described as resourceful, manipulative, and potentially dangerous when cornered. Most striking, perhaps, were his periods of silence and introspection. On rare occasions he would spend nights alone, huddled on a stoop or wandering the city streets lost in thought. Some speculated he was haunted by the ghosts of his past, or maybe simply reckoning with the fact that he'd become exactly what everyone had always expected him to be. The line between victim and villain grew ever thinner in his mind. By 1977, at age 31, Kevin Miller's name was already infamous in law enforcement circles across several Midwest states. His reputation for violence, his uncanny ability to evade capture, and his utter disregard for authority made him a marked man, not only a danger to others but ultimately a ticking time bomb for himself. As the infamous events of that fateful Minnesota winter would demonstrate, Kevin was a man at war with the world and with himself, his choices carving a path of destruction no one could have fully predicted. Continued crimes and unstable life. Kevin Miller's downward spiral into a life of crime wasn't marked by a single explosive moment. Instead, his journey followed the grim cadence of missed opportunities, fractured relationships, and the steady collapse of any semblance of normalcy. By his late 20s, any hope that he might turn his life around had withered under the weight of repeated incarceration and broken trust. After a fleeting attempt at domestic stability, prompted by his marriage to Lorraine and the brief joys of fatherhood, Kevin's behavioral patterns grew only more chaotic and erratic. Substance abuse, particularly alcohol and prescription pills, became a constant presence, muddying his already volatile temperament. He darted between menial jobs, unable or unwilling to stick with anything for long. Every small victory, a few weeks of sobriety, a promotion at work, was swiftly undone by suspicion, resentment, or an outburst of violence. His marriage to Lorraine unraveled almost as quickly as it began. Infidelity, physical altercations, and financial strains set a relentless pace of arguments that often ended with police at their doorstep. Lorraine, terrified both for herself and their daughter Emily, ultimately sought refuge with her parents, leaving Kevin to stew in an empty apartment cluttered with bills, empty bottles, and bitter memories. The sense of abandonment only deepened his anger and his disregard for consequence. Any attempts at reconciling with Lorraine ended in disaster. On one particularly harrowing occasion, he was arrested after a drunken altercation at her parents' house, further cementing his reputation as a dangerous and unpredictable figure. It wasn't long before Kevin's criminal activity escalated from relatively petty crimes, check fraud, minor theft, to more serious violent offenses. He became increasingly reckless, lashing out at those who crossed him, both strangers and former friends. Several incidents stand out in law enforcement records: a brutal assault on a bar patron during an argument over a lost bet, a failed robbery attempt at a convenience store that ended with the store clerk hospitalized, and multiple encounters with police where Kevin responded to arrest with resistance, threats, or outright violence. Each arrest was followed by a brief spell in jail, parole, and inevitably, a return to old habits once back on the streets. The instability carried over into every aspect of his life. Unable to keep a job, and now blacklisted from several local businesses due to theft or threats, Kevin drifted between cheap motels, friends' couches, and the occasional woman who was drawn in by his brooding charisma, but quickly overwhelmed by the darkness that accompanied him. Rumors swirled about his involvement with local drug dealers, and though never convicted, there were whispers of arms trafficking, stolen goods, and even contract work for small-time gangs. Family ties were all but severed. Though Emily occasionally wrote to him, Lorraine refused to allow her daughter any visits. Kevin's parents, already estranged, offered no support, having long since resigned themselves to the reality of their son's self-destruction. The only consistent connection he maintained was with a handful of fellow ex-cons, men who neither questioned nor judged, but whose influence further solidified his criminal identity. By the mid-1970s, Kevin Miller's life was a tapestry of violence, distrust, and restless movement. He lived in constant anticipation of betrayal, by loved ones, by the system, or even by his own impulses. His mugshot became a familiar sight in police stations across several states, and for many who crossed paths with him, the sense of unease lingered long after he was gone. Each crime, each failed bid for redemption, pushed him farther from the possibility of return. Ultimately, Kevin became both the architect and the prisoner of his own unraveling, his story a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of violence, addiction, and unchecked rage in an unforgiving America. The height of crime and the fateful prison break. By the spring of 1977, Kevin Miller had become a name that sent shivers down the spine of everyone in Minnesota's criminal justice system. Over the years, the string of felonies tied to him, armed robbery, aggravated assault, car theft, and even a high-profile bar brawl that left 2 men hospitalized, had stacked one after another like a grim resume. But it was a brutal attack on a young couple in a Minneapolis alleyway that marked the last straw and sealed his fate. A hammer was wielded with shocking force, and although the 2 victims survived, they were left traumatized and permanently scarred. The media pounced, portraying Kevin as the ultimate symbol of the decade's lawlessness. Caught in the aftermath by a SWAT team, he showed no remorse, calmly regarding the news cameras that documented his perp walk into the Hennepin County Jail. In the holding cell, Kevin's demeanor remained disturbingly tranquil. Guards swapped stories about his uncanny ability to read people and situations, how he rarely seemed ruffled even in the face of overwhelming odds. Some claimed his calm masked a predatory mind always searching for a crack in the walls. That proved prescient. Within weeks, he set in motion the most audacious plan of his criminal life. Given a kitchen assignment due to good behavior, an irony never lost on those who actually read his psychological evaluations, Kevin blended in and observed. He memorized guard schedules, noted which doors stuck and which buzzers were slow, and made mental maps of the service corridors the staff assumed only they understood. He also managed to steal a boning knife from the kitchen, wrapping it in layers of rags and tucking it behind a loose tile in his cell. Anyone who happened to watch him during those days would see a model prisoner, quiet, quick to help, rarely the source of any trouble. In truth, every gesture was a calculated move. His opportunity came on a cold, snowy morning in May. A routine court transport to downtown Minneapolis meant fewer guards than usual. Budget cuts and complacency converged at the worst possible time. Kevin was handcuffed to a corrections officer in the back seat, while another officer sat in the front, chatting idly with the driver. Less than an hour into the journey, he faked an urgent need for the restroom. The officers, looking forward to finishing their shift, relented and pulled into a deserted rest area off the interstate surrounded by endless white fields and dense woods. What happened next played out in seconds. Kevin unleashed his hidden knife with ruthless efficiency, first wounding the officer he was cuffed to, then lunging through the gap between the seats to stab at the driver. In the chaos, the vehicle skidded onto the icy shoulder, nearly flipping over. Shouting threats and waving the blade, Kevin forced the remaining officers out into the snow, took control of the prison transport, and sped off into the storm, leaving behind a trail of blood and disbelief. The prison bus was found several miles away, abandoned in a ditch just outside a sleepy farm town. Bloodstains on the upholstery, and hurried, deep footprints in the snow told the story of a desperate escape. Highway patrol officers immediately set up roadblocks, and a multi-county manhunt began. The relentless blizzard smothered tracks, cloaked barns and back roads in white, and lent Miller the cover he dreamed of. What followed was 3 days of chaos, panicked headlines, cold and frightened deputies searching barns, and radio bulletins warning the public to lock doors and stay vigilant, lest the infamous Kevin Miller find shelter in the night. This brazen escape set the stage for the home invasion and the psychological horror that was about to be unleashed on a family completely unprepared for the intrusion of evil into their winter sanctuary. Escape in the white snow. Kevin Miller's escape into the wintry Minnesota wilderness was a masterclass in desperation and cunning, a tale that would later be retold with a kind of dark fascination by both law enforcement officers and the local townsfolk. The moment he slipped from the scene of the prison transport attack, he vanished into a world transformed into a monochrome labyrinth by relentless snowfall. Tree limbs sagged under the weight of ice, fences and fields disappeared into drifts, and every sound felt dampened by the thick quilt of snow, save for the frantic, crunching footsteps that marked the first moments of his freedom. Equipped with little but stolen clothes and the adrenaline of a cornered animal, Kevin moved with grim determination. He knew that search parties would fan out in all directions, and that helicopters, dogs, and heavily armed patrols would soon crisscross the countryside. The blizzard was both his enemy and his shield. Sub-zero temperatures gnawed at exposed skin, yet the same swirling flakes and howling winds erased his tracks within minutes. In this hostile environment, every decision was a wager with fate: hide in an abandoned barn, risk breaking into a hunting cabin, or keep moving deeper into the woods. He kept off main roads, slogging through thick timber and across frozen creeks. Hunger and exhaustion pressed in on him quickly, but so did the certainty that being found meant a brutal fight or instant death. He scavenged what he could, ransacking an empty ice fishing hut for canned beans and a fraying blanket, filching a flashlight and a battered map from the trunk of a snowed-in pickup. On the second morning, as the storm raged with renewed violence, he huddled beneath the splintered roof of an old tool shed, its few dry corners thick with the scent of diesel and rotting straw. Here, sleep came only in fitful patches, broken by nightmares and the distant wail of sirens. News of the escape had by now raced through every radio and television in the region. Roadblocks multiplied, farmers checked their barns with loaded shotguns tucked under their arms. Kevin glimpsed the panic he'd unleashed in flashes. Posters with his face, officers in snow gear trudging through fields, neighbors whispering at the edge of grocery store parking lots. Yet he pressed on, steered by both survival instinct and an electrifying sense of possibility. The cold bit deeper with each hour, and dwindling food forced him to make a reckless move, breaking into the quiet, isolated Anderson residence on the edge of Maple Creek, where warmth and tragedy alike awaited. The Anderson family haunting, and the hidden specter. As the blizzard raged outside, its howling winds and relentless snow creating a surreal curtain between the Anderson family and the outside world, Kevin Miller stalked the outskirts of Maple Creek. Even in such harsh weather, his presence moved like a phantom, silent, sinister, and utterly unpredictable. With every farmhouse he passed and every flickering porch light he saw through curtains of snow, his mind churned with restless calculation. He wasn't just running from law enforcement, he was stalking warmth, safety, and the promise of anonymity, no matter the cost to those within reach. The Anderson home represented everything Kevin had lost: stability, comfort, and the ordinary routines of a loving family. On the edge of town, their weathered two-story house managed to feel both isolated and inviting, with its pale yellow light glowing through the kitchen window and a thin trail of smoke curling upward from the chimney. For the Andersons, Robert and Marjorie, both recently retired, Jenny, their daughter, who'd moved back home after a divorce, Andrew, her husband, an engineer whose work frequently called him away, and young Lily, precocious and always on the edge of laughter, it was a safe haven. For Kevin, it was an opportunity, a fragile world he could shatter to ensure his own survival. To the Andersons, the storm was an inconvenience, an excuse to enjoy hearty stew, board games, and the snug embrace of home. For Kevin, it was the perfect cover. As he crept up the back porch, his stolen boots left shallow prints that were quickly swallowed by drifting snow. He paused, knife gripped tight, taking in the muffled sounds of family life, a radio murmuring, the clink of silverware, the gentle rise and fall of voices. There was a haunting normalcy to their world that both fascinated and angered him. Did they understand how fragile it truly was? He waited until the light in the kitchen dimmed, Marjorie setting down her mug, Robert turning out the stove, before striking. The side door, rarely locked in this trusting community, yielded easily beneath his force. He entered quickly, his frozen breath clouding the air as he brandished his weapon and demanded silence. Marjorie, first to notice him, nearly dropped her teacup. Robert, instinctively protective, took a step forward but froze as the blade shimmered in the kitchen's faint glow. Kevin's commands were simple and chilling. Stay quiet. Don't try anything. He herded them into the living room, binding their wrists with dish towels and electrical cords he pulled from drawers. When Jenny returned from the late shift at the local school, she was dragged in before she could react. Andrew and Lily, arriving from a neighbor's house where they had stopped to feed a dog, found chaos where peace had reigned only moments before. At first, Kevin posed as a desperate but rational man, a fugitive who wanted nothing but a place to wait out the storm and would leave them unharmed if they cooperated. He promised no one would be hurt, but even as he made these promises, his eyes flickered with suspicion and flickers of emotional turmoil. He moved from room to room, checking for phones, unplugging the landline, and throwing the family's only radio against the wall to ensure no cries for help would reach the outside world. Every hour, he reshuffled his captives, sometimes putting Lily and her mother in one room, Robert and Marjorie in another, exploiting the family's terror and confusion. Through windows thick with ice, the world outside seemed impossibly far away. With the town paralyzed by snow and the phone lines mostly down, Miller played a masterful psychological game. He whispered threats, at times sitting eerily still with the Andersons in the semi-darkness, at others exploding in sudden fits of anger provoked by the smallest sound or movement. Jenny tried to memorize the layout of his movements and gauge any weaknesses, but Kevin was ever watchful, sleep-deprived, yet sharp, his paranoia stoked by the fear that law enforcement might burst in at any moment. He forced the family to act as if nothing was wrong during the rare occasions someone knocked on the door. Once a neighbor came by to loan a snow shovel. Miller, hidden behind a curtain, pressed the blade of his knife against Marjorie's ribs and threatened unspeakable things if she betrayed him. With trembling hands, Marjorie smiled at her neighbor and insisted everything was fine. Only after the door closed did Miller release her, his gaze wild and unmoored. Over the days, the Anderson home became a prison, its rooms once filled with laughter now charged with dread. Kevin raided the kitchen, emptying the pantry shelves, guzzling beer from the basement fridge, and even pausing to read Lily's school books in a strange mockery of peace. The Andersons' hope ebbed and flowed with each hour. They tried to share silent signals. Jenny feigned illness to lure Kevin into making a mistake. Robert considered an attack but feared the consequences for his family. At night the storm persisted, wind rattling loose siding and casting shifting shadows across the walls. Sometimes Kevin spoke at length, offhand confessions of his bitterness toward society, his sense of betrayal by the justice system, and fleeting glimpses of regret. Yet these moments vanished as swiftly as they appeared, replaced by cruel jibes or angry accusations that the Andersons were judging him or plotting behind his back. The psychological strain mounted. Hunger, cold, and fear gnawed at captors and captives alike. Outside, the manhunt continued. Police scoured nearby barns and dispatched snowmobiles to remote cabins. They found only abandoned hideouts and broken branches. While inside the Anderson house, evil seemed to settle in like the bitter chill crawling under the doors. The family realized that only their unity, quick thinking, and a degree of luck might allow them to survive the ordeal. On the third day, the psychological torture reached a crescendo. Desperate and increasingly irrational, Kevin coerced Jenny into preparing the family car for a final escape. As she left the house under his tense watch, she managed a fleeting, whispered plea for help to a neighbor, barely enough, but it would prove crucial. Law enforcement soon descended on the Anderson property, guns drawn and nerves frayed. But before salvation came the chaos of confrontation, the violence of a cornered man refusing to surrender. Even after the blizzard receded and order was restored, the Anderson home remained imbued with a sense of haunted fragility, a place altered forever by the intrusion of a man whose own life had been shaped by countless storms, both literal and metaphorical. For Maple Creek, what happened behind those snowbound walls would stand as a harrowing lesson on the unpredictable reach of desperation, and the chilling power of evil to penetrate even the safest sanctuaries. The tragedy begins on a fateful afternoon. On that fateful winter afternoon, life in the Anderson household unfolded as gently as the snowfall outside, a scene of simple warmth and routine bliss, where the world's dangers felt safely distant behind walls thickened by years of Midwest resilience. In hindsight, the serenity of those hours seems almost painfully ironic, for the subtle shift that signaled the coming tragedy was nearly imperceptible. A flickering shadow at the frosted window, a burst of wind that seemed just for a moment sharper than before. It was Marjorie Anderson, matriarch of the family, who first sensed the anomaly. She was stirring a pot of beef stew on the stove, humming an off-key tune as she tasted for salt and wondered whether she had enough carrots to stretch the meal for two unexpected guests who'd called earlier to say they might drop by that evening. Through the kitchen window, Marjorie could see the encroaching slate-gray sky and the ever-thickening snowdrifts rolling up against the porch steps. She didn't notice, until it was too late, the figure that hovered hesitantly near the edge of her line of sight, half-shrouded in snow and dusk. Kevin Miller had watched the Anderson home for nearly an hour, scoping every pattern of movement, the opening and closing of doors, what lights flickered on, when a car crunched into the driveway. He'd chosen this house not for any specific vendetta, but for its relative isolation, and, paradoxically, the feeling of normalcy and safety radiating from within. Cold and hungry, his adrenaline buzzed with that familiar uneasy blend of desperation and anticipation. He felt more than ever the razor's edge between anonymity and irrevocable violence. There was nothing cinematic about his entry. Kevin slipped up the porch with the agility of someone who'd spent entire winters ducking pursuit, his breath swirling in frantic, ragged explosions that almost steamed in the sub-zero air. He tried the handle, unlocked, as in so many rural homes where trust was currency. Stepping inside, he moved with the single-minded force of a man whose options had narrowed to a single ruthless channel. Marjorie barely uttered a sound before he pressed her back against the wall, gloved palm over her mouth. The axe, intended for splitting kindling, was in his right hand, and she saw in his eyes that strange polarity, a flicker of apology quickly snuffed by resolve. "Don't scream," he whispered, and the coldness in his voice burned deeper than any winter gust. Her whole body trembled, but her years as a mother had taught her that stillness, not panic, was her best weapon now. Kevin worked quickly. He locked the kitchen door behind him, drew the curtains, and yanked the phone cord from the wall. Marjorie watched, immobilized, as he checked each connecting room with the wariness of someone who expected a gun behind every door. When Robert Anderson entered moments later, dusting snow from his shoulders and stamping his boots, he too was subdued, shock freezing him in place before his jaw could even set. Kevin barked orders with a chill, rehearsed efficiency. "Sit, hands behind your neck, don't look at me." He bound their wrists with a length of extension cord he found by the phone stand. The knife, smaller than the axe but no less menacing, was quickly produced, flashing dully in the kitchen light. For a brief, frantic span, the Andersons hoped this was just a robbery. But Kevin needed more than valuables. He needed sanctuary. Jenny Anderson, their adult daughter, was the third to encounter the intruder. Returning from her part-time job at the local pharmacy, she parked her car and hurried up the walk, wind whistling around her earlobes. The instant she opened the door, Kevin's arm was around her, dragging her inside. Her startled cry gave way to shock as she recognized the fear etched on her parents' faces she had never seen look quite so old, so frightened. Andrew and Lily, delayed after feeding a neighbor's dog, arrived as dusk began to settle. Kevin, now even more on edge, corralled them inside at knife point. He seemed to grow more frantic with every arrival, tension stretching his features until he resembled some feral creature, cornered yet unwilling to break. Each time he forced new arrivals into the living room, he shuffled the Andersons into new positions, binding, unbinding, and retying knots like a chess player, trying to anticipate every countermove. Time within the Anderson home took on an elastic, surreal quality. The hours between 4 in the afternoon and sundown felt endless, a purgatory where ordinary sounds, the ticking clock, the kettle's shriek, boots thudding against the porch, became amplified, sinister. Kevin rummaged through the house in short staccato bursts, demanding food, spare clothes, and radio silence. A single misstep, a cough, a sideways glance, was greeted with the sharp promise of harm. The Andersons communicated only in gestures, clenched hands, blinking eyes, the way Robert squeezed Marjorie's shoulder when he thought Kevin wasn't looking. As the storm outside gathered force, the Andersons' small world contracted brutally inward. Kevin paced, occasionally muttering to himself, at times fixating on a photograph of the family perched on the mantel. For the first few hours, the possibility of escape, of fight or flight, flickered between the captives. But Kevin anticipated their every move, quashing any sign of resistance with threats or deft violence. He was at once erratic and methodical, his mood shifting like the blizzard winds, unpredictable and unyielding. Marjorie, desperate for something to anchor her, focused on Lily. The youngest in the family, Lily sat silently on the living room rug, her eyes rimmed with red but dry of tears. Kevin had left her untied, perhaps out of pity or oversight. She never tried to run, too petrified by the stare he reserved for her when conversation lagged. Jenny, meanwhile, observed Kevin intently, cataloging every twitch, every throwaway line, searching for a weakness. She noted how his hands shook when he wasn't brandishing a weapon, how he winced when a car passed outside, how each new sound seemingly jarred his fragile equilibrium. The Anderson men, Robert and Andrew, found themselves calculating odds. How quickly could they reach the knife block in the kitchen? Could they overpower him before he hurt someone? Should they wait for Kevin to nod off or risk a frontal assault? Yet every time courage surged up inside them, they saw the girls' faces, or felt Marjorie's hand squeeze, and reminded themselves there were fates far worse than humiliation or robbery. Dinner that evening took on the quality of a forced ritual. Kevin watched them eat with the guarded envy of someone who hadn't shared a meal in months. He demanded an extra portion, guzzled Marjorie's coffee with such rapid desperation that it scalded his tongue. The Andersons, for their part, rotated spoons through trembling hands, whispering prayers in their heads, conscious that even the smallest defiance might cost them dearly. Outside more snow fell. The world receded, muffled not just by ice but by the pressing weight of fear and powerlessness. Kevin passed the long night pacing, sometimes interrogating his captives about their neighbors. Who will come knocking, when, what will they expect to see? At other times lapsing into prolonged silence. He permitted no lights save the kitchen lamp. Windows remained shrouded in darkness, and not once did he relax his vigil. By the time midnight crept past, the Andersons understood. Their lives had cleaved sharply along the line of this afternoon. The ordinary had given way to the unthinkable, family bonds now their sole armor against the cold and the chaos. Unbeknownst to them, the world beyond the blizzard was stirring to their crisis. But inside, the night stretched on, every shadow and creak a reminder that survival was no longer a routine, but a deliberate, exhausted act of will. The psychological ordeal, victims under siege. If there was ever a moment when time seemed to bend and stretch, to fracture reality with every heartbeat, it was during the 3 harrowing days the Anderson family spent as hostages in their own home. For Kevin Miller, the icy weather outside wasn't his most potent weapon. Fear was. He wielded dread and uncertainty with a precision honed over years of life on the outskirts, testing the psychological limits of his desperate captives. With the phone cords ripped free and every window clouded by frost, the Anderson home transformed from sanctuary to cage. Miller's first tactic was isolation and unpredictability. He kept the family separated, sometimes locking Robert and Marjorie in the spare bedroom, other times moving Jenny and young Lily into the den, switching them at random intervals, always watching reactions. He barked orders but almost never raised his voice. The real terror was in the quiet, in the calculations he forced upon them. Who would he see as the threat? Which of them would bear the brunt of his next mood swing? The family members were forced into a disturbing simulation of normality. During rare interactions with neighbors, an insistent knock from the next-door farmer wondering if the Andersons needed help digging out the walk, or a phone call from Jenny's friend checking in, Miller demanded silence or slick lies under threat of unspeakable violence. Marjorie, at his signal, would paste a trembling smile onto her face, wave through the frosted glass, and pray her eyes didn't betray the horror unfolding just out of sight. Any deviation from his script would be punished, sometimes with bruised wrists, other times with new threats whispered so close she could smell the sour tang of panic on his breath. Sleep deprivation and hunger compounded the family's anxiety. Miller refused to let them rest comfortably, waking them with sudden shouts or bright flashes of the flashlight pilfered from the shed. He demanded a rotation for standing watch at the window, as if enlisting them in his own feverish paranoia, parading them past the panes in an attempt to make any onlooker believe nothing was amiss. Meals taken in the gloom were brief, mechanical affairs. Marjorie would ladle stew into bowls, hands shaking as she wondered whether any bite would be her last. Miller always ate first, sometimes refusing food just to watch it go cold in front of the others, basking in the subtle power of denial. By the second day, his psychological attacks grew more sophisticated and sinister. He began alternating between outright cruelty and twisted kindness. After a particularly tense standoff, he allowed Lily an extra blanket, but only if Robert pledged to stay kneeling on the kitchen floor for an hour without moving. He quizzed Jenny on her childhood memories, then mocked her answers, ever probing for some hidden wound to pick at. To Andrew, he issued direct and impossible orders: fix the car but don't start it, change the snow tires but never step out of his line of sight. Each demand was a test ensuring no one felt secure in even the smallest task. The sense of helplessness reached a suffocating pitch in the evenings. After darkness fell, Miller would pace the house, speaking in low monologues barely above a whisper. Sometimes he recited snatches of poetry or scripture. Other times he ranted about his own childhood, his theories on betrayal, or the worthlessness of the American justice system. The family listened, terrified, to confessions that shifted erratically between victimhood and bitterness, as though Miller were prosecuting his own invisible tormentors. The women in the family bore an especially heavy psychological burden. Marjorie clung to her routines, wiping countertops, folding clothes, even humming lullabies through chattering teeth, attempts to anchor her daughter and granddaughter in something resembling hope. Jenny, ever the observer, tried to mark subtle patterns in Miller's behavior, searching for the thread of logic behind his unpredictable acts. Lily, wide-eyed and silent, seemed to age years with each new challenge, training herself not to flinch as Miller passed by. When Miller sensed his influence waning, he escalated the psychological games. He staged mock escapes, pretending to hear police dogs outside, forcing the family to rehearse what to say if officers burst through the door. He threatened to tie Jenny up and leave her overnight in the tool shed, and after several hours of terror, called her back inside with the cruelest of smirks. Andrew endured sleepless nights interrogated about whether he had installed secret signals or set traps in the house, defending himself against imagined charges that grew ever more bizarre as Miller's paranoia peaked. For 3 days, the Andersons not only feared for their lives but faced the constant exhausting burden of protecting each other, of absorbing Miller's wrath, deflecting his suspicions, and improvising gentle reassurances in the quiet huddles snatched during the rare moments he withdrew. Every whispered conversation counted, every fleeting smile between mother and daughter served as a fragile promise they might one day remember home as something more than a haunted place. Outside, the blizzard masked the house in silence, but inside, dread snowballed, a quiet terror more profound and damaging than any physical injury. The psychological abuse left its own scars, wounds that would never fully fade. Even after rescue, every family member would carry the burden of those 3 days, reliving the dizzying unpredictability, the humiliation of subjugation, and the erosion of their sense of safety. The ghost of Miller's presence would linger, a bitter lesson in the power of fear to warp memory, trust, and love itself. Police search in vain. The search for Kevin Miller became one of the most exhaustive and grueling manhunts in Minnesota's modern history, turning the gentle farmlands and snow-blanketed woods into a tense network of dead ends and frustrated hopes. The operation launched within an hour of the prison bus discovery. Highway patrol combed the surrounding roads, sheriff's deputies fanned out through fields and tree lines, and local volunteers braved the bitter cold, all hoping for the smallest sign of movement. A footprint, a bit of disturbed snow, the flicker of a foreign light in an abandoned barn. From the very start, the elements conspired against the hunters. The blizzard that shielded Miller's flight also hampered every tracking effort. Visibility rarely edged past a few dozen feet. Snowdrifts buried fences, erased tire tracks, muffled the engine growls of search vehicles, and made two-way radios crackle with static. Dogs brought in from neighboring counties lost the trail within minutes, their noses overwhelmed by the shifting winds and swirling frost. Night descended early, swallowing up fields and yards the way panic swallowed up the town. Command centers were hastily set up in church basements and firehouses, maps pinned to walls and littered with red thumbtacks, lines radiating out to mark the expanding hunt. Each passing hour without a lead frayed the nerves of both authorities and families glued to their radios, waiting, praying, unwilling to believe that a desperate felon could simply vanish into the white void at their doorstep. As day stretched into night and back into day again, the ritual repeated. Teams would be dispatched to remote outbuildings, sheds, empty schools, and farmhouses whose owners were either away or too afraid to stay inside. Each visit involved careful protocol: a knock, a shouted warning, boots crunching on ice, flashlights stabbing into silent, frost-rimmed corners. Every time they found nothing but cold echoes and the occasional stray animal, hope dimmed just a little more. Rumors began to swirl throughout the county, adding layers of confusion atop the logistical nightmare. Someone swore they'd seen a figure dashing across Route 22 at dawn. Another insisted they heard yelling down by the old sawmill. Deputies chased after each report with desperate urgency. Some townsfolk worried the criminal might already be hiding among them, watching from a darkened window or holed up in a neighbor's basement. Households left porch lights burning through the night as signals for help or warning. Children were kept home from school and farmers loaded their shotguns just in case. The tension was a living thing, crawling through the community and making every shadow in every window seem more sinister than the last. Law enforcement, meanwhile, endured the quiet agony of chasing leads past the point of exhaustion. Sheriff's officers rotated in and out of command posts, their boots soaked and skin wind-burned from long hours outside. Maps grew muddled with new marks and dead ends, and officers traded bitter jokes over lukewarm coffee, that Miller must have grown wings or turned himself invisible to survive this long unseen. The media descended with their own brand of chaos, eager to prod at community wounds for the sake of a gripping headline. Headlines blared: "Fugitive still at large. Search expands as blizzard rages on the Anderson home nestled at the edge of town somehow escaped scrutiny at first." Its unremarkable silhouette, just another farmhouse set against the monochrome sprawl, hidden by the storm and Miller's careful manipulations. Introducing roadblocks and car inspections yielded nothing. Patrolmen returned, noses running, nerves frayed, and always empty-handed. Each false alarm or dead end sent another ripple of frustration and fear through the task force. Technology, limited as it was in the 70s, offered scant aid. There were no security cameras on street corners, no drones to thermal scan outbuildings, and phone lines were patchy at best due to ice-laden branches snapping under their own weight. Communications often fell apart at the worst moments, messages garbled, updates delayed, resources scattered. All the while, Miller's legend grew with every hour he remained unaccounted for, people half expecting him to slip from some snowbank like a ghost and vanish again before anyone could react. The psychological toll mounted. Officers lay in borrowed sleeping bags on gymnasium floors, replaying the failures of the day. Had they missed some sign? Had they searched a barn too quickly or trusted a lead too blindly? The frustration of knowing that a terrified family could be enduring a nightmare, just out of reach, one darkened window or clever lie away, gnawed at everyone. In whispers, some officials started to fear the worst, that this would end in tragedy, and that any delay might mean the loss of innocent lives. And yet, for all their determination and skill, the searchers found that the storm was the ultimate adversary, implacable, indiscriminate, and eerily silent in how it hid both predator and prey. With each passing shift, hope grew thinner, and the snow kept falling, relentless and unyielding, covering the countryside and the evidence alike in a cold, heavy shroud. Inside the command posts, tension simmered. Heated debates sparked over how best to grid out new search sectors, which rumors to prioritize, and whether to pull in backup from neighboring counties. Some argued for patience, while others demanded a bolder, riskier approach. But as night after night yielded only silence and disappointment, a creeping sense of helplessness began to settle. Local leaders had to reassure a frightened public with little reassurance themselves. The governor's office made statements about bringing in more resources, but the storm made most outside efforts impractical. Meanwhile, communication with residents was a balancing act, needing to instill caution without inciting panic, all while detectives privately wondered if Miller had already slipped through their grasp entirely. The local radio became both lifeline and harbinger of anxiety. Police bulletins interrupted music and homey chatter with updates that grew more desperate by the hour, and always, beneath the procedural veneer, a darker realization stalked every deputy's mind. Each hour the fugitive remained free was another hour of possible horror for an unknown victim, somewhere out there in the blinding snow. Yet, there was nothing to do but check that next barn, question that next tipster, and hope, against all odds, that the next patch of unbroken white would finally give up a clue. Climax: the escape and confrontation. As the world outside the Anderson home began to wake from the blizzard's suffocating grip, the atmosphere inside was electric with tension and desperation. Kevin Miller, now gaunt and hollow-eyed from exhaustion and fraying nerves, sensed the rapidly narrowing window for escape. The psychological games and strictly enforced routines of hostage life had devolved into a chaos of dread and resignation. The Andersons, battered but clinging to hope, were shaken by each movement, each order barked by their captor, knowing the fragile balance could shatter at any moment. On the morning of the third day, the snow relented just enough for a dull gray light to filter through ice-frosted windows. Miller paced relentlessly, muttering to himself and watching his captives with a frantic paranoia. The news on the battered radio, briefly restored before he smashed it, had blared the news of his escape and the ongoing search. He knew it was now or never to break out of this frozen cage and disappear for good. His plan was desperate. He would force Jenny Anderson, whom he deemed the least likely to fight back, to drive the family car while he used the rest as insurance against police intervention. The Andersons played along, subdued and carefully obedient, but beneath the surface, hope flickered. Jenny, especially, had internalized every movement, every opportunity, and was waiting for the barest crack to act. As Miller hustled the family through the door, the battered sedan's doors creaked open. He barked orders, pressing the knife against Jenny's side, eyes wild. Jenny slid behind the steering wheel, hands slick with sweat. Marjorie, Lily, Robert, and Andrew were squeezed in the back seat, muscles aching from 3 nights on the living room floor. Kevin barked directions, forcing Jenny to drive away from the center of town and toward the less patrolled country roads. His intention was clear: find an unguarded exit, hijack a new car if possible, and vanish. What Miller didn't know was that Jenny, as they left the house, made fleeting, desperate eye contact with a neighbor shoveling their walk. Her whispered plea, more a gasp than an outcry, found purchase. The neighbor, catching something terribly wrong in Jenny's manner and the family's white-faced silence, slipped back inside and immediately called the authorities. Within minutes, multiple squad cars barreled toward the Anderson property and fanned out along the frost-bitten lanes. As the family car wound its way along deserted roads between forests and frozen fields, the tension was unbearable. Miller, knife raised and scanning the horizon for police, pressed Jenny to take shortcuts and back roads. Unbeknownst to him, every route was now being quietly covered. Police set up impromptu roadblocks along likely escape paths, staking out crossroads and bridges, their radios crackling with urgent updates and terse orders. Officers, many of whom had gone sleepless for days, braced for confrontation. Some prayed the encounter would end peacefully, most braced for the worst, having read Miller's file and seen the wounds he'd left behind. At the first glint of siren lights reflecting off the treetops, Miller erupted into a panic. "Turn around! Get off the road!" he shouted. Jenny's hands trembled as she tried to follow his wild, contradictory instructions. At a snow-choked crossroads, Miller forced her to swerve into a stand of birch trees, the car bucking and grinding to a halt in a shallow ditch. As sirens wailed closer, Miller pulled the family from the car at knife point, dragging them off the road and into the underbrush as officers spilled from their cruisers, weapons drawn and flashlights knifing through the shadows. "Back off or I'll do it!" he shrieked, shoving the Andersons in front of him like living shields. The police, spread out and treading cautiously through waist-high snow, tried negotiation. A veteran sergeant, voice measured, eyes locked on the desperate fugitive, pleaded with Miller to let the family go. Voices echoed in the frigid air, amplified by the quiet. "You're surrounded, Miller. Nobody has to get hurt. Let them walk." For endless minutes time seemed to stop. Snow plumed from tree branches as nervous officers repositioned. Lily whimpered, clutching Marjorie's hand. Jenny, voice rough with fear and exhaustion, begged Miller for mercy, for her family, for a chance to end things without more bloodshed. But Miller's mind, pushed beyond the brink by cold, hunger, and his own demons, latched onto violence. He tightened his grip on Robert, who winced as the blade pressed into his neck. "You want me? I swear to God I'll do it!" Miller screamed, eyes darting from muzzle flashlights to the black, impassive barrel of a nearby shotgun. The situation teetered. Officers radioed for a tactical team, but the risk to the Andersons was acute and immediate. Hesitation could be fatal. Suddenly, in a convulsive, almost suicidal move, Miller broke his standoff and lunged for the nearest police cruiser, dragging Jenny in a chaotic scramble. He wrenched the door open, shouted for the keys, and threatened to kill Jenny if anyone fired. The officer inside, caught by surprise, fumbled his weapon. Police barked warnings, the split-second decision hung between tragedy and deliverance. A single shot rang out as Miller shoved Jenny aside and lunged for the officer's sidearm. The crack of gunfire echoed off the icebound fields. Miller crumpled to the snowy roadside, his escape, his reign of terror ending in the very instant he crossed the line from threat to imminent lethal action. Officers surged forward, pulling the Andersons to safety, Jenny sobbing hysterically, Robert collapsing in relief and shock. Paramedics on standby at the edge of the cordon rushed in to tend wounds. The nightmare at last was over, though the trauma would echo far beyond that frozen lane. As the news broke, the community exhaled as one, all of Maple Creek and the wider region finally freed from the grip of siege and terror. Officers lingered, some shaken by the violence, most simply numb with relief that the Andersons, against all odds, were alive. For days afterward, news crews descended on the rural town, picking over the shattered snow in search of details. The names of heroes and victims were lauded and mourned, and the questions began: how had it come to this? What breaks a man so badly that he brings a community to its knees? And how, after the storm passed and the blood was washed from the ice, would anyone ever sleep easy again? Maple Creek would never return to innocence. For a generation, the events of those nights, especially the final frantic chase and confrontation, became a dark legend, a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can tilt into chaos, and how courage and fear can exist side by side in the most unimaginable ways. Consequences, tragedy, and lingering haunting. The aftermath of the Anderson family siege was as raw and chilling as the storm that had shrouded Maple Creek in silence. In the days and weeks that followed, the town pulsed with a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief that the hostage ordeal had ended, but profound sorrow at the price paid and the scars left behind. For those who survived, every creak of the house, every gust of wind rattling the windows, felt like an echo of the nightmare they had endured. For the victims who could not be saved, the loss cut a hole in the fabric of the town's identity, and for the community as a whole, nothing would ever be quite the same. The Anderson home soon became a haunted landmark. The snow eventually melted, but the darkness that had hung over those rooms seemed to seep into the wood. The photographs on the mantel, the faded rug in the living room where the family once gathered. Police tape lingered for days, a sad and strange caution to curious onlookers and news crews who descended from across the state. Reporters circled the neighborhood, hungry for interviews and quick sound bites that captured the collective horror, but few residents were willing or even able to speak about what had truly happened. Survivors struggled to resume their lives. Jenny, the eldest daughter, could not walk through the kitchen without being seized by flashbacks. Kevin's voice, quiet and threatening, the sensation of cold steel against her side, the memory of her family tied and terrified around her. Little Lily, spared the worst violence but scarred by the ordeal, began sleepwalking through the house at night, waking in corners and closets, clutching her battered stuffed animal for comfort. Their father, Robert, tried to repair the shattered windows and ruined doors, but every hammer blow brought back the chaos of those frozen days. The psychological wounds were not limited to the Andersons. Neighbors checked their door locks twice before bed, something almost unheard of in Maple Creek. Children asked their parents uncomfortable questions about evil and safety. Schools hosted counselors and held special assemblies on trauma, trying to explain a tragedy that, even for the adults, was not fully comprehensible. At Sunday Mass, prayers for the Andersons were mingled with a more general plea for the restoration of trust and peace the town had once taken for granted. The law enforcement community, too, was shaken to the core. Police, deputies, and search and rescue volunteers replayed the operation in their minds, wondering if they had missed a clue, if there was a moment when a different decision could have changed the course of those dark days. There were investigations, reviews, and, inevitably, blame on the prison system that failed to contain Kevin Miller, on the budget cuts that left rural departments understaffed, on the miscommunications that delayed the focus on the Anderson homestead. Some officers left the force unable to cope with the burden of what they had seen or what they believed they could have prevented. The tragedy sent ripples through state and national media. The choices made by the prison board, parole committees, and even local politicians came under fierce scrutiny. Town hall meetings in Maple Creek erupted in anger and grief. Parents demanded to know how such a dangerous man could have slipped through the cracks, why their rural sanctuary had become the stage for unspeakable violence. Editorials debated the balance between rehabilitation and public safety, while cable news pundits used Maple Creek as shorthand for everything wrong with the criminal justice system in America. Yet for all the outside noise, it was the private battles that proved hardest to fight. Trauma lived in silence. In Lily's long pauses before answering the phone, in Jenny's tendency to drift away during family dinners, in Robert's sudden outbursts when a car backfired down the street. Nightmares visited each survivor in their own way. The Anderson home itself, after much debate, was eventually sold below value to an out-of-town family unaware of its full history. Those who stayed behind in Maple Creek always felt a chill when they passed the familiar mailbox, now bearing a different name. Memorials sprang up, a metal bench at the park bearing the names of the lost, a commemorative plaque at church, small, awkward gestures to contain grief too large for words. Each anniversary of the ordeal brought media vans, out-of-state visitors, and emotional exhaustion for the Andersons' surviving kin and the broader community. The Anderson tragedy became a cautionary tale, often told in hushed tones to warn about trusting strangers or letting little things slip by unnoticed. With time, some wounds scabbed over, but reminders remained everywhere. Out of fear and reflection, Maple Creek's residents founded neighborhood watch programs, lobbied for improved emergency response plans, and re-examined everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between home and threat. Some locals left the area for good, unable to shake the sense of vulnerability. Others found unexpected camaraderie, forging bonds with neighbors forged in shared loss. The sense that evil could intrude anywhere, anytime, no matter how remote or peaceful the setting, altered the collective psyche. Nationally, the case prompted meaningful reforms. Prison escape protocols were overhauled across the Midwest, and policymakers pushed for better tracking and reporting on dangerous offenders. New legislation was introduced in the state Senate concerning rural policing, mental health outreach, and victims' resources, aiming to prevent a repeat of the events that had devastated Maple Creek. But not all consequences could be neatly addressed by policy or community resolve. At its heart, the tragedy left behind stories unfinished and questions without resolution. The survivors wrestled daily with guilt and helplessness. What if we had fought back sooner? What if we had tried to escape? Many would see shadows at the window or hear phantom footsteps on the stairs for years afterward. For families who lost loved ones, the injustice felt bottomless, not only because of Miller's violence but because of the persistent, aching lack of closure. Even after the headlines faded, Maple Creek bore quiet witness to the truth that trauma does not dissipate simply because the world moves on. In the end, the Anderson family's ordeal reached far beyond a single crime or a single winter. It forced a reckoning with the fragility of security, the unpredictability of human cruelty, and the extraordinary endurance required simply to move forward. In the stillness after tragedy, in the hush of snow covering the old Anderson property, the echoes of loss and survival lingered, testimony to an event none of them, nor their town, would ever truly leave behind. A humanistic lesson and lingering reflections. The aftermath of the Minnesota blizzard tragedy was marked not only by mourning and outrage but also by a wave of self-interrogation and an almost existential reckoning within the community and beyond. In the months and years that followed, survivors, townsfolk, and even the most hardened investigators wrestled with an ache that words only ever seemed to skim. What did it mean to live safely? How could evil seep through the cracks of ordinary life so easily, and what responsibility did everyone share in keeping cruelty at bay, or at the very least sounding the alarm before darkness took over? One of the most poignant human lessons was the realization of collective vulnerability. People who'd once waved casually from their porches or ran errands without a second thought, now looked at each other with new, questioning eyes. The trust that had been the fabric of Maple Creek's simple routines was torn, and rebuilding it proved harder than anyone anticipated. Families installed new locks, bundled their children tightly before letting them out to play, and blocked doors that had once been perpetually open. More significant than physical security, however, was the drive to rebuild the social contract. Neighbors checked in with each other more often, town meetings became standing room only, and even the most reticent elders showed up to speak their minds or simply bear witness. Tragedy, in its cruel way, reminded everyone that a community's soul is guarded as much by watchfulness as by warmth. Yet, Saint-Exupéry once wrote, "To be a man is truly to be responsible." For the Andersons and for so many who walked away from the snowbound ordeal physically unscathed but psychically bruised, that sense of responsibility became both a shield and a burden. Marjorie, for example, spent many nights reliving those hours, replaying 1,000 micro-decisions. Should she have locked the door more resolutely, warned someone sooner? To what extent was she responsible for what she could not reasonably have foreseen? Survivors everywhere are haunted by these questions, and with each new day, must learn to reconcile the randomness of disaster with the basic impulse to find meaning, to make future tragedy less likely through vigilance and empathy. Equally enduring was the lesson in courage, not the cinematic kind that involves heroics and perfect timing, but the quieter, more complex bravery of survival. The Andersons' resilience, frail and imperfect as it sometimes felt, became a reference point for family and friends. Lily, the youngest, found herself, years later, instinctively comforting classmates who'd faced their own small nightmares. Jenny, emotionally scarred, discovered the necessity, and at times the sheer agony, of letting others see her vulnerability. They both embodied the realization that living in the aftermath is an act of courage all its own, and that healing is possible only when pain is acknowledged, not hidden. Events like this forced the wider society to confront the invisible machinery of systems meant to sustain and protect people. Newspaper columns and televised debates for months afterward circled around how quickly the thin veneer of order can collapse. Why were old failures and criminal oversight so persistent? How could mental illness slip through the cracks? What role did poverty and isolation play in the creation of a person like Kevin Miller, and what, if anything, could institutions have done differently? In the wake of public outrage, reforms were proposed, some practical like updated emergency protocols for rural areas, better mental health screenings for inmates, and enhanced training for both law enforcement and school counselors. But many residents recognized that systemic change could not reach every dark corner. The emotional legacy of the tragedy, the silhouettes in frosted windows, the nightmares that haunted children and adults alike, the knowledge that evil sometimes wears an utterly ordinary mask, was something only the passage of time and determined acts of kindness could alleviate. Ethicists and clergy were called upon to help articulate the shaky morality that often emerges from tragedy. Churches held candlelight vigils and grief workshops, encouraging parishioners to transform their anger into something constructive. Educators spearheaded after-school programs focused on resilience, self-advocacy, and the value of speaking up about discomfort or fear. One subtle but profound result, the town's culture of minding one's own business, began to shift, making space for well-intentioned intervention, for kindly nosiness that could save lives in moments of crisis. Above all, the community was left with the lasting lesson that evil does not thrive in a vacuum, but in silence. The Anderson tragedy imparted an urgent respect for gossip that sometimes needed to be checked, for oddities in behavior that warranted more than a passing glance. If one neighbor seemed off, or a kid at school was becoming isolated, people were more likely to notice and to ask questions. This vigilance was not born of paranoia, but of a newfound understanding that sometimes the best line of defense against catastrophe is the willingness to care, actively, even awkwardly, about the lives of others. Yet for every lesson that shaped future choices, certain unresolved questions remained, a kind of collective ache that no explanation or reform could fully ease. Was it fate, or a string of fixable errors and random chances that placed Kevin Miller and the Andersons on a collision course? High school students and reporters speculated in essays and op-eds, while older residents shook their heads, hesitant to draw tidy moral conclusions from such untidy grief. Families affected directly or indirectly by the crime learned that memory can be both a wound and a warning. The Anderson home itself became something between a monument and a cautionary tale, its walls in later years sheltering generations who never saw the blizzard but grew up with its story whispered around kitchen tables and at graduation parties. People who lost relatives or friends in the ordeal observed anniversaries in private, or lit a candle each year in the town square, silently promising to remember and to do better, even as they struggled to define what better meant. Looking back, the real legacy of the Blizzard tragedy was not simply sorrow, nor even the urgent call for preparedness, but an enduring sense that the work of keeping one another safe is never truly finished. It must be constantly renewed, in school hallways, on front porches, in the small acts of noticing and reaching out that make up the fabric of community life. There will always be those moments that leave us changed and those questions that linger long after the headlines fade. Could we have done more? Can we ever do enough? Only by holding both the pain and the lesson close can a community hope to move forward, a little wiser, a bit more watchful, and never, ever forgetting the price of complacency.